Welcome everyone to our afternoon session for Community for All conference. Thank you if you were able to be with us in the morning, and it went really well. If you didn't have a chance to hear some of those presentations or would like to on your own go look at the other presentations for the conference, they're all on the Community for All online conference.online website that you have access to as a ticket holder. So we hope you will go and check out some of those presentations. And of course, we're also going to be recording this conversation that we'll be having coming up. So if you have to step out and you're riveted, which I'm sure you will be, we will have it all recorded for you, we hope, and you can access it. And at some point, we'll even have it more publicly shared too. So I'm going to just start by saying my name is Karen Jackson. I am the founder and director of Faith Inclusion Network. We are based in Norfolk, Virginia, and we are just thrilled to bring this conversation topic to you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking because I want to get right to it. Our moderator today is David Morstad, and I want him to introduce himself a little better, but I will say he has been such amazing support to Faith Inclusion Network. He has been one of our national advisors for some time now, and a good friend too. So I'm going to hand it over to David.
Hi, friends. Thank you for coming here. As Karen mentioned, I'm Dave Morstad. The fire behind me is not virtual, it is real. I'm in Wisconsin and it's cold here. It's a privilege to be a part of this. It always is. I have just enjoyed a great deal. I spent most of my career, the better part of 40 years, with a faith-based provider in the developmental disability field. In retirement, I've continued to be an active partner with the Institute on Theology and Disability and groups like Faith Inclusion Network and so on. And I also currently serve on the Governor's Committee for People with Disabilities in Wisconsin. I count it as a claim to fame that 5 years ago, I was appointed to that committee by a Republican governor, and a year ago I was reappointed to it by a Democratic governor, which you don't often hear in the U.S. these days. And so it's a committee that I currently chair, and public policy and faith and disability, that intersection, always an important one for me. But I would like to go around also. And
David, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we did not mention that we have captioning available. We have a CART person. And if you will go down to the bottom of your screen, hopefully you can see the option to turn that on. And if anyone has any questions about that, please use the chat and we'll try to figure out how to make sure you can access that. I'm so sorry. But yes, captioning is available, and I hope everyone can see our ASL interpreter as well. All right, carry on.
Thank you very much. That's an important note. And I think you will agree about the strength of this panel, because I do want to go around quickly and just have folks introduce themselves. And I'm at the mercy of who's on my screen in this particular order. So Patty, why don't we start with you, if you could do a quick introduction.
Certainly. Thank you, David. My name is the Reverend Padraic Collins-Bohrer, or Patty for short, P-A-D-D-Y. I am a priest in the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Rochester, New York. I am also a member of the Faith Community Inclusion Team, or Spiritual Care Team, at Heritage Christian Services in Rochester, New York, an agency that supports individuals who live with developmental disabilities, both in residential programs and in day programs. It's wonderful to be here with everyone today.
Thanks, Patty. Next is Aaron Kaufman.
Yes, thank you, David, for moderating. And I, for 10 years, was on the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council, so I think it's cool that you have a similar role in Wisconsin. My name is Aaron Kaufman, Senior Manager of Legislative Affairs, focusing on all things disability for the Jewish Federations of North America. And I also happen to be a person living with cerebral palsy.
Thank you, Aaron. Good to have you with us. Curtis?
Thank you, David. My name is Curtis Ramsey-Lucas. I serve as editor of the Christian Citizen, which is a digital first publication of the American Baptist Home Mission Societies. For those of you who may not be familiar, ABHMS, as we call it for short, is the domestic mission agency of the American Baptist churches. And prior to that, I served as director of interfaith engagement with the American Association of People with Disabilities, working closely with the Interfaith Disability Advocacy Coalition. Thank you.
Thanks, Curtis. Rachel, welcome.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Chung. I am the Disabilities Coordinator for the Archdiocese of Washington, Department of Special Needs Ministries. And we work with 139 of our parishes across 5 Maryland counties and also Washington, D.C. And we serve children and families living with disabilities, those living with mental health, and also we have a ministry to persons who are deaf. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Good to have you with us. And Nadim.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nadine Bashir. I currently serve as an imam, religious leader at a Plano Mosque, which is in North Texas. And I've been doing this for the last 10 years. However, just recently, I've been getting into more of special needs advocacy in my own community. Just seeing that there's simply a growing need. I really want to make a difference in people's lives. And the fact is that I do also have a daughter that is special needs, and she is the world to me. She is such a blessing in my life, and so is all my other daughters. And so keeping this in mind, I actually went ahead and started my own initiative called DREAM, which stands for Disability Resources, Education, and Awareness for Muslims. However, we are an organization that is working with other faith organizations. Thank you.
It's good to have you all with us. In fact, it's an honor. I think my only adversary here for the next 50 some minutes is the clock. And so I'm not going to waste a lot of time. I want to get right into this. But let's start with a kind of a broader question. I'd like to start from the perspective from just the relationship of faith and public policy advocacy in general. It's not something that shows up in conferences like this all the time. In fact, in some environments, there's actual pushback on the notion of whether or not it is appropriate for faith communities to engage in that. But what I want to get at, I guess, is not just from a disability standpoint, but we're privileged to have a number of different traditions represented here. And I would like your thoughts on what the role of faith communities is or should be or could be when it comes to just public policy in general. And Aaron, you're right there in Washington, so I'm going to start with you. I should add right here that I'm not going to call on people throughout this. If there's something on your mind, just say it. But Aaron, I'll put you on the spot here.
Well, thank you, David. And that's a great question. I believe that as faith leaders, we bring a certain moral authority to our work. And I'm a registered lobbyist here in DC, advocating on behalf of people with disabilities for JF&A. And I would say that coming at it from a faith tradition is very beneficial, particularly when certain members of Congress are somewhat antagonistic to spending money or providing necessary supports for ideological reasons. I'm able to talk about how Moses had a speech impediment and how we are told to not put a stumbling block before the blind. And many of these members are very religious. So coming at it, and being able to talk faith with them, so to speak, is really advantageous. I often will refer to the Jewish teaching of B'Tselem Elohim, which means that in Judaism, we believe that everyone is created in the image of God. And so I found coming at it from a faith perspective puts me, I would say, at an advantage with certain congressional offices compared to my friends that do secular disability advocacy. And I believe faith communities are so big that when we put our mind to something, we are a force to be reckoned with in the public sphere.
Rachel?
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron. And David, I just wanted to quickly kind of play off of what you said. I think the challenge, of course, is that within our faith communities, there's already diversity of thought, and also our leaders can sometimes be hesitant to get involved as well. But I think our faith certainly calls us to that action. And for Catholics, we also have our principles of Catholic social teaching as well, which calls us to promote just and life-affirming policies. And also our faith communities, often we're on the front lines. We're there at the food pantries, we're there at the clothing drives, and we're encountering people firsthand. So I think we do have a duty to bring that to the public sphere, our experiences walking and accompanying people.
As thank you, Rachel. And I'm also thinking of our in the Episcopal Church, we follow our baptismal covenant and to seek and serve Christ, loving our neighbors as ourselves, and striving for justice and peace among all people, respecting the dignity of every human being. So as an Episcopalian and in our communities, looking at where we can provide justice for people in need is always important as Episcopalians.
I think sometimes we confuse in our country, in our polity, if you will, separation of church and state with separation of faith and politics. And I don't think those things equate. I think separation of church and state, separating the institutions of religion from government, is a good thing. And it frees up the faith community really to be about the work. And it doesn't mean that we separate our faith from our politics. So that's where I would kind of land with that. It gives us the freedom to engage and to bring our perspective to bear on questions of justice and equity and opportunity.
The foundations and values obviously very strong that we would bring to that work.
Can I add something very briefly?
Sure.
I think our distinguished Iman wanted to add something too. Nadim, I just think we're stronger together because prior to coming to JFNA and working on the federal level where I work with the Lutheran Services of America Disability Network, frequently in the Episcopal Church too, I lobbied before the Maryland legislature, and one of my favorite partners as we tried to improve the lives of Marylanders with developmental disabilities was the Maryland Catholic Conference. So I know that there are obvious differences between faiths, but it's better when we come together based on shared values.
Nadim?
And I want to second what Aaron said. Thank you so much, Aaron, for that. And because one thing that what I have seen in my own observation is that there's a lot of good going on in our communities, but I think that what's important is that to have certain coalitions or organizations that are working on a city level, state level, and then on a national level, where you can have representations from each faith, each major faith, or all faiths actually, but have some certain leaders that know what disabilities are, what is inclusion all about, people who are actually at the forefront working on this and coming together, because as Aaron said, we might be individual voices, but when we come together, we do make a very strong team. And I think that, it doesn't really matter. I understand today there's so much going on when it comes to politics, but putting aside our religious differences, our political differences, the reality is that we all, as families that have families with disabilities or individual disabilities, as voices for them, we do have one common goal, and that is that we want them to be taken care of, and we want them to be treated like no different than anyone else.
I appreciate that. Oh, I want to move on to see if we can bring this to a little more focus to the topic of this conference, and really the focus of the time. This experience we've had in the last year, this pandemic experience, has certainly highlighted and in a lot of cases exacerbated some issues among people with disabilities, issues we've known about for a long time, issues of isolation, issues of access to healthcare. I know that in Wisconsin, we launched a survey about 8 months ago, and we're stunned at how many people with disabilities were having food insecurity issues just because everything else had shut down around them. So and also, frankly, we've been reminded that technology, while it has allowed things like this, and as great as that has been, there's a real divide of the haves and have-nots in terms of technology. So the examples are all around us. Within that context, and perhaps a larger one around it, I'm curious about some of the really key public policy issues that people with disabilities are facing these days. What occupies your concern and your activity in that regard? Someone want to dive in first?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think actually Nadine mentioned about also city, county, state, how important a lot of decisions that impact people with disabilities are so local. And of course, at the national level. I would say one of the key issues actually to me is a workforce crisis with our adult services. There's a turnover rate of 51% for those that provide direct services to people living with disabilities. I mean, that is a tremendous impact of quality of care. The average wage is $11.46 an hour for a job that's a lot of expectations around that. And I think that's a justice issue of a living wage that we can all agree on. And also to point to what you said, David, about who's essential worker. And every day the people working as direct support professionals had to go to work during this COVID time. And some of them were actually excluded from pay that was given to other workers, extra pay. They weren't considered essential. So I know that's not always an issue we think of in the forefront, but that workforce crisis really is, again, becoming even more aware during this time. And I would also say this time of COVID has brought that issue of access to healthcare in a broad way and specific way as a key policy issue.
Yeah, others' response to that?
Well, one of the major things that we're working on, David, is twofold. Within JFNA, we have a wide variety of providers within our network that support people with disabilities, and that support enables them to thrive. But many of our providers are suffering extreme financial hardship right now as a result of the pandemic because of increased overtime costs, having to close their day programs, and increased food costs at group homes and things like that because people are home 7 days a week, for 3 meals a day. So one thing that JFNA is working on in the reconciliation package is a FMAP bump, which is just a fancy way in lobbying speak of saying increasing the federal contribution to Medicaid for home and community-based services like job coaching, showering, shaving, dressing, etc., that will provide needed resources to providers. Also, we know from our friends at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities that 25% of SNAP recipients are people with disabilities. So that is why we are pushing to extend the 15% increase in the maximum SNAP benefit beyond that passed in the last stimulus bill beyond June 30th, because food insecurity is such a key need, as you pointed out.
The fact that we are stuck with this reality that the largest source of funding in those environments is the Home and Community-Based Services Waiver Program, and that funding is inadequate now and shows every sign of not increasing, is a burden, and it's already at the point where I think upwards of a third of direct support personnel are themselves on some kind of means-based assistance from the government. It is no wonder that in many respects, I'm surprised that the turnover is only 51%. Key issues from your standpoint, Patty or Nadine?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Texas, and to be honest, Texas is one of the worst states in the United States when it comes to how many people are insured. And one of the things that I've seen also is that community members who have come to me, they just find it very difficult and simply impractical for themselves to pay so much money on a yearly basis because of the, first of all, you have the COVID crisis, and then due to the job market and so forth. Because here in Texas, there's a lot of families who have to pay almost like $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 besides their monthly premiums, just so that their kids can get a proper adequate amount of service and therapy. And that's not practical for every single family. So I think that, especially when it comes to Medicare and Medicaid, like in the state of Texas, it does provide help to these families. But when they go to these top-notch doctors and physicians and therapists, they simply turn them away, that we don't accept that insurance. So there's a discrepancy there, and that, everyone has to come on the same page. And that's where the issue, in my opinion, does lie. And then I think the second issue that I feel like, which has to be really tackled, is the whole idea about special needs living and adulthood transition. I think there's a really big gap over there. I understand there's a lot of organizations that are working individually, but once again, as Aaron said earlier on, I think we got to pull together all of our resources and our minds so that this transition is an easy one, especially after they even graduate from high school.
Thank you, Nadim and David. And an issue here in the Rochester area is caring for people who are experiencing mental health crises, and the best way to do that. We've had 2 situations over the last several months where individuals have been mistreated by police here in Rochester, and in one case, an individual died in custody of police. And in another case, a young girl was mistreated. So figuring out the best ways to care for individuals and providing the need that they need, whether that's helping to change laws in New York State or in other ways.
Curious if there is, it appears as though there are some localized and perhaps regional statewide issues. Is there, among this group, is there any active advocacy going on at the national level for things that would go after whether it's Medicaid funding or any those related issues?
Well, I articulated those, and I'm happy to share, put in the chat the Jewish Federations of North America's action.
That would be most appreciated. Thank you. I should just add, kind of as an aside here, there is a very active chat going on as an undercurrent to our discussion here. This is actually a great way to do it. It's far less disturbing than having people talk in the back of the room. I'm loving this. There's some great connections being made. I heard someone observe on a recording a couple of days ago, and he was talking about racism, and he noted that he was a white guy talking to a bunch of other white guys about the evils of racism, and that there was something fundamentally screwy about that. But I think sometimes we've been caught in a similar trap in terms of advocacy, where you end up with a lot of non-disabled people like me knocking on doors of other non-disabled elected officials trying to make a point, and there just doesn't seem to be a lot of personal connection. I think the history that we've shared has been a lot about advocacy for people, advocacy for somebody else. There's a piece of scripture, and frankly, I used it in this session description, that is shared by a few different traditions in the Book of Proverbs, that we are to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. I think in a more contemporary view, we prefer something that comes closer to we stand with people. I think Dave Hingsberger once said, be my microphone, not my voice. But I'm very curious about how we negotiate that difference, if you will, between speaking on behalf of or speaking for people and standing with them or speaking with them. And what does the difference between those two things look like? Talk about your experiences. Oh, Aaron, I think you're muted. I'm sorry.
I feel like I may be talking a little bit too much, but since no one else is talking, I will add my 2 cents.
By all means.
And that is that I, as a person with a disability, think that somebody with a disability should always be involved in advocacy and in decisions about people with disabilities, because of the old disability rights maxim, nothing about us without us. But sometimes my friends with disabilities get mad at me because they say, well, if you're not disabled, you shouldn't be engaged in this work. And I tell them, no, that's patently false, because of the fact that the LGBTQ rights movement didn't happen with just members of that community. The Chicano movement didn't happen with just members of the Mexican American community, and the women's movement didn't happen with just women. And I could go on and on. So we need allies. But one of the things that's frustrating is that far too often when decisions are being made about people like me, it's just allies in the room, and you need some mix. So that's why when I organize lobby days, I always tell my affiliates, yes, bring people without disabilities, but you need to ensure that at least you have 1 or 2 people with disabilities, because frankly, it's a little bit more compelling for politicians to hear the lived experience of someone with a disability than maybe the CEO of an agency who cares very much, but is talking more about Medicaid funding in terms of the bottom line, rather than, hey, this is a lifeline for me to have an aide help me get dressed every day.
And just to kind of add on to what Aaron said, I think our role can be asking first what the person with disabilities might need help with. So often I've accompanied Megan Jones. I saw her come on to the Zoom call as a self-advocate, and she just needs some assistance bringing her thoughts together, and she could certainly speak for herself. So kind of that behind the scenes work, transportation to our advocacy days and places, and organizing appointments. And that way the person is at the forefront. And I would never discount as well people that have significant needs and perhaps don't use words to communicate. because their presence is advocacy. Them being there is an advocacy. So I think we got to bring in all kinds of partners and people together, and we can do the behind the scenes work, and we can really just stand behind them. But first ask the person what they would need help with to advocate, of course, as well. And we can fill that role. And I'm just going to make a quick plug for voting rights very quickly. Whenever we advocate, Megan will always mention, I'm a registered voter in your district. And that's more the first thing she says, not I'm a person living with disability, but I'm a registered voter in your district. And that gives power to her voice as well. Just to add. And our voices as well.
Thank you, Rachel. Adding to what Erin and Rachel have said, I am also a person who lives with cerebral palsy. And so my experience of advocating for myself, going through the ordination process in the Episcopal Church, which is challenging for anyone, but it was, I believe, in my experience, even more challenging as a person living with cerebral palsy. So it's really important to be at the table. And I would say that my experience, and I often say that if I'm not at the table, I'm on the menu, because I would often find that different leaders in the church would be talking about me, and they would say, oh, Patty, we had this wonderful hour-long conversation all about you, and this is what we decided, and how do you feel about that? And so it's really, really important to be involved in sharing, yes, sharing with people what I need, but also having a conversation so that we can come to a decision together. And that's really important as an example of having someone stand with me and walk with me in my journey.
I want to sort of piggyback off what the Reverend just said. And, you know, when you talk about speaking for people with disabilities, I think that does require education to begin with. When you're talking about standing with them, that requires advocacy. But I'm going to put sort of like I know I'm going to probably strike a nerve here when I say this. I want to put like a political touch to this in one way, that we have stories that emerge on social media where you have people, whether it was at schools, whether it was at college campuses, people who were hurt, people who were abused, people from the special needs, or anyone who has any type of disabilities. And I usually don't see there's a lot of pushback and there's a lot of advocacy. There might be some talk on social media. There's a lot of parents expressing their frustration and anger. And I think that when you look at a movement such as the LGBTQ movement, I mean, today everyone understands that if you say something negative, there are going to be lawsuits that are going to be against you. You will be held accountable. When you speak about certain movements, there is going to be some consequences. I think as a faith community, as communities that advocate for disabilities or families with disabilities and so forth, and when we talk about inclusion, I think there has to be some standing up there. There has to be some consequences. There has to be some accountability. And for example, I know when I say this, I may be stepping on some toes here, but to be frank about this matter, I was really hurt, honestly, when I heard the former president making a mockery of someone with disabilities. It really, really hurt me. That, I mean, this is a person who wants to be a leader for the country, and here he's making a mockery. And to be honest, I did not see any pushback. I never saw there was any kind of, there was no apology. There was no accountability. And that really is telling. So I think when we talk about advocacy, I think you have to talk about the different aspects of advocacy and standing up for the special needs community and the community that, you know, they cannot at times speak for themselves. We have to be there, and we have to be part of coalitions and organizations to really put this in place.
One of the things that I've always found valuable about the or surprising maybe about the inclusion of people with disabilities in this movement is not necessarily that it just brings strength to a point that you are trying to make, but it, I think, is educational for me to find out what issues really are. Because there have been numerous times that I thought I knew what the major issues were, and then there's something unexpected that it just, and I'll give you a perfect example. During these pandemic times, obviously it has been the practice when you're seeking medical care that it was like, you can come in to see the doctor, but that's all. You can't have anyone with you. And we were curious because we'd heard some talk about people who wanted to have a support person with them and were told no, and we wondered how widespread this was. In the last couple of weeks, our survey data has come in, and it was responded to by hundreds of people with disabilities, and 48% of them wanted to bring a support person, either for mobility, for sign language, to explain things that the doctor was saying, for follow-up, for a variety of reasons. 48% of them were told no, they can't come in. And this has become a real issue. I mean, it's an issue that's gotten the attention of the Medicaid services people here in Wisconsin, because these are all places who accept dollars, and they are violating the pathways to reasonable access for these folks. It's an issue that was nowhere on the radar of people without disabilities. And I'm just curious about the kinds of issues you've run into that have there been others that have been somewhat unexpected for you?
I can't speak to this, but what I can say is that the Center for Public Representation has done a lot of work on this issue, and they have succeeded in making hospitals and states change policies. So I would suggest that you reach out to them, David.
Yeah. Our first stop was with the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which told me in a very polite email they'd only had one such instance and it was resolved. I don't think they were talking to the same people I was. Rachel, you seem to be nodding.
Yeah, I was thinking too about an issue that was a little bit surprising, was in one of our counties, and this might sound surprising, but it's more of just a right that people were not, a bartender could say no to someone just because they had a disability, doesn't matter their age. And kind of like, oh, all right, that's something. But it really,
well, now it's serious is what you're
saying. But now,
yeah.
But it's kind of one of those issues that surprised me, because I didn't realize, oh, okay, that doesn't seem like a big deal. But someone living with the disability, they wanted to have that ability. It wasn't that particular thing, right? It was being denied just because. So that was kind of an interesting issue. I would never think was important. I would just it would go off my radar very quickly. But, and they actually fought for that to be changed. So, so again, asking people with disabilities what's important to them is kind of that key, always going back to that.
An issue that I am mindful of as I think about transportation. I'm a person that doesn't drive, and within the last 3 years, rideshare, Uber and Lyft have come here to Rochester, New York, upstate New York, and it makes transportation very easy for me at any time of day and night. And I'm a person that I can walk around, but I'm very mindful of my sisters and brothers who use wheelchairs and other mobility devices where getting into a car may not be very easy. So really looking towards improving Uber and Lyft in communities like Rochester, smaller communities where wheelchair accessible vehicles are available is something that I'm mindful of, and I know that is needed for it to be for the service to be used by a wider community.
David, I think it's interesting. We're sort of getting into broader areas and opportunities for advocacy, I think, and you know, both speaking on behalf of, speaking with, you know, because it's not simply about addressing matters of public policy or legislation. There's a whole kind of range of ways that I think we can be advocates for and with. And I think about that in terms of, you know, the broad need for employment opportunity for people with disabilities and issues of underemployment of people with disabilities. And those are things that were problematic before COVID that have been exacerbated by COVID. You know, persons with disabilities face unemployment and poverty rates twice the national average. And so there's certainly a public policy component of that, but there's also, I think, opportunity in our communities of faith to be advocates for the employment of people with disabilities. I mean, we have folks in our pews who own small businesses. We have employers that we have connection with. Are we making a case with those folks for expanding employment opportunities for people with disabilities? So I think there's we're getting into kind of a broader range of possibilities, I think, for the advocacy we're talking about.
And
Really good point.
Just to come off of what Curtis was saying as well, I think housing is something we can really collaborate on a policy level as well with other groups, because housing affordable but accessible. You can have these beautiful housing units, but if they don't have accessible units, and that kind of speaks to that, looking at the lifetime of the person, that of course a person living with disabilities wants to be in the community and part of the community, and part of that is employment and affordable and accessible housing. And I think that's where it comes to that local level as well, where a lot of housing regulation is county based. You see those boring signs up there for zoning, you know, zoning hearings, and but that's where decisions are made, right? Impactful decisions. So just kind of partnering with other organizations as well to remind them about affordable and accessible.
I think all of these ideas, David, that Curtis had, my friend, we used to be on IDAC together, but I think, and I think the point about zoning is excellent that Rachel made, but I think the biggest challenge that people with disabilities face is discomfort around people with disabilities, and also attitudinal barriers. Because when I go on the Hill or when I'm just in the community and I meet somebody for the first time, I can tell that they are uncomfortable around me. So when I meet an aide on the Hill who's uncomfortable, I say I work for the Jewish Federations in North America. We have a whole public policy office in DC, and I will say, for obvious reasons, pointing to my walker, I do disability policy, and they laugh. And the meeting goes well. But I think, you know, people have this idea that people with disabilities can be only grocery store baggers, which is a fine job. But they have this pigeonholed image of people with disabilities. And when it's challenged, or when they see somebody outside of a quote unquote disability job or disability role, they are uncomfortable. And the last point I'll make is that within faith communities, you get some resistance, because people accurately say, well, Congress exempted churches, synagogues, and mosques and other houses of worship from the ADA, so I don't have to do anything. Or even if they end up doing it, you have to nag them. Like at my particular synagogue, I attend Zoom Shabbat services, and I had to nag them for weeks to do it. It's not that they didn't want to, it's just out of sight, out of mind. So until we can eradicate the attitudinal barriers and the discomfort that people feel and get them to focus on it more, all the policies in the world are great, but they're not going to make a big difference.
Yeah, I think if you were to poll advocacy organizations wherever they are and say, what are your top 3 initiatives? If jobs, transportation, and affordable housing are not the top 3, those 3 are going to be in the top 4 or 5. They're undeniable issues. I can remember Steve Eidelman saying once that he was talking with a guy with a disability, and his top 3 were I want a job, an apartment, and a girlfriend. And Steve's observation was, I think he knows that if he gets the first one, he can probably get the other 2. And I think that's exactly the way that it goes. The values that people with disabilities bring into the world and things they want, not all that different from the things that we want as well. One of the things that Bill mentioned this morning in his very eloquent remarks, he reminded us that you don't go through this alone. There are really some very effective advocate organizations out there. Some of you work with them or have worked with them. I'm curious if you can just share with whom you work or who's open to partnerships, where the shared values are. What are the most effective existing advocacy partners that you have found? Whoever wants to grab a hold of that.
Well, I would say in my role as a faith community inclusion specialist, I help advocate for individuals who live with developmental disabilities, to build relationships with churches in the Rochester community as they go out and say, yeah, I want to be included in the church. I want to be a reader. I want to be a greeter. I want to do all these things. And so my advocacy is moving alongside those individuals, and hopefully everything will go well, and the individual can have the conversation with the clergy person or other leader. But I'm also there if the clergy person is, has concerns or needs to know how do I best work with this person. I can have that conversation as well. So that's one of the things that I'm very proud to do as part of my role at Heritage Christian Services.
I would certainly say American Association of People with Disabilities continues to be an effective organization in these areas, and also for the work of AAPD, bringing the Interfaith Disability Advocacy Coalition to life. That coalition now has a life of its own with the leadership of folks like Aaron and others that is ongoing. But I would say those 2.
Thanks for mentioning that, and their legacy of interest in faith and disability issues is long and illustrious. So it's a good one to mention.
Currently, I'm actually just trying to grow awareness in the Muslim community because the Muslim community still is a majority immigrant community. And a lot of our organizations right now are still being operated by the immigrant community. And there's a lot of cultural baggage that comes. There's a lot of unnecessary stigmas that have been created. And so one thing that we're trying to do, part of the initiative that I've started, is just trying to grow awareness is number 1. And number 2 is making people of the Muslim community aware of all the different resources. I think the Muslim community is very, they're very passive. They're not really the kind of community that will come out and try to speak out loud about these kind of things. So what we're trying to do with this organization or this initiative is I'm working with different churches, different organizations, and just trying to collect all the resources to tell our families that there is so much out there for you. Because a lot of times I hear from my own community members that there's not a lot going on. And very contrary to that, I usually remind them that no, there is a lot going on, and then I share those resources with them. So that's the way, or that's the style of advocacy right now that I'm currently working on.
And I found too, David, the ARC chapters. I think I saw someone put that in the chat. Both the ARC US and local state chapters are very open to partnering with our faith communities. And I think Aaron actually mentioned organizations like the Maryland Catholic Conference. I think that's our role and members, like for me in the Catholic Church, to make sure that they're aware of those issues impacting people with disabilities as they go to advocate. Many of our faiths do have an advocacy arm, and sometimes they're not aware of those issues, or again, they're not putting together that if we advocate for affordable housing, we have to make sure it's accessible. So that's kind of a key role we can play in our faith communities might have that type of advocacy arm. And we can be a voice for them to think about that. Like we had in Maryland about minimum wage raise, say, all right, don't forget our direct support professionals, right? There are also those workers that need that wage raise. So that's kind of partnering and as well with those existing ones.
I would also say that I do a lot of work with the National Disability Rights Network. In every state and territory, there is a P&A, a protection and advocacy system that in my state it's called Disability Rights Maryland, but they do tremendous work in terms of monitoring and enforcement and providing legal advice and advocacy for people. I also am a former board member of the National Association of Developmental Disabilities Councils, which is the umbrella org for all DD councils in the 56 states and territories of the United States. So there are tremendous, and I work a little bit with the Association of Community Network of American Network of Community Options and Resources, which is a trade association for providers of developmental disability services. So there are numerous wonderful groups that I work with.
And I would add, thank you for that. Anchor is great. The disability rights protection and advocacy organizations in each state and territory are great as well. Sometimes I will tell you their interests can dig pretty far into the weeds, but almost every one of them has a regular email list. And if you get on those email lists, you can get a pretty steady diet of what are the important issues. And almost always they're telling you ways in which you can get engaged, simple ways to communicate to legislators, and so on. So we're unbelievable as it seems. We're coming up on time here, and I just want to acknowledge the fact that there are probably a lot of people tuning in here who may have an interest in this, but like a lot of things, it can seem overwhelming. So the final question is, what is your best advice to give to someone who maybe has an interest but has not been active in this before? What do the first steps look like?
I will go first. I will say there's three things: engagement, engagement, engagement. I mean, you cannot really understand the matter till you don't get engaged, and simply just even reading about it is not sufficient. You have to work with someone, you have to talk to people. And to be honest, I mean, I would have not known about anyone here had I not been engaged. So I think engagement is the key thing here.
Rachel, what's your best advice?
I know I'm hesitant to follow from Nadine's incredible and simple, right? Engagement. And I would say that persons living with disabilities and their families, just first of all, they are the experts. They don't have to know every nuance and every, you know, how things operate, but just encouragement, maybe engagement and encouragement that they are the experts. And our legislators, they, if you're not on their radar, you're not on their radar. And you can't assume that they know your issue and just you are the expert. And I would say to be, people might be surprised. I've heard from many legislators that personal visits and handwritten letters are so key instead of mass emails or those types of things. So again, sometimes going back to the basics are going to engage those leaders and continue to engage them throughout the year. Because again, if you're not on their radar, you're not on their radar. So we have to make sure that they know that.
Thanks, Rachel.
I could piggyback on that a little bit. I'd like to share something that I learned in just kind of watching and learning from a mentor to me and maybe to many others on this call, Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, who did this work with the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism for many years and was a person living with a disability. You know, she showed up and she knew you had to develop enduring relationships with legislators and their staff, you know, the phone calls that were important to make and the meetings that were important to attend. You know, there's a lot of stuff that we see on social media that's, you know, hashtag this and and campaigns of that kind, which are important. But I think the just working at relationship with people who are you know, making policy, who can affect change, and doing that over time is critically important.
Is twofold. Don't feel that you have to start big. Not everyone has to be a lobbyist on the federal level. If you notice that a playground in your county or your city is inaccessible, contact the Parks Department and start an advocacy campaign for that. See if there can be more handicap spots put in a local shopping center. Go to town halls and share your stories about why disability matters to you. Ask candidates questions about people with disabilities. You know, go to one of our advocacy days. But I just want to say, as wonderful as this conversation was, I hope in 5 years or 10 years from now, we're not having this conversation because inclusion is so commonplace for people with disabilities.
Amen. Patty, any thoughts?
Yes, yes. Thank you, David. Thank you, Aaron. My best advice would be to let people know what you want and figure out how to get there, whether that's transportation needs or housing or other needs, to have a place at the table, to be part of the conversation so that you're at the table and not on the menu.
Nice. Well, I must tell you, I was looking forward to this experience this afternoon for purely selfish reasons, but only to find out that it had extreme value to a lot of other people as well. So thank you all for that. Curtis and Aaron, Nadim, Rachel, Patty, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to turn this back over to Karen Jackson, who I bet has some things she would like to say.
Well, first of all, on behalf of everyone who's on the everyone who is here at the conference, I want to say thank you to you all for taking the time to engage in this conversation. It's something that I have really felt strongly that faith communities, as David started out the conversation with, I thought that a lot of faith communities or people I've talked to sort of shy away from idea of public policy, that that's not part of what they're doing. They're worried about their own inclusion in their own faith community, but we're part of a bigger community. We are part of the whole conference, community for all, you know, right? So, it just made sense to us that we had this conversation. And one more thing is that I just saw in the chat about, you know, why are we, someone posed the question, I didn't see who it was, I'm sorry, you know, why are we still having this conversation? But what's so encouraging, and as Bill Gaventa said this morning, is that, you know, we're still in the conversation, but it's definitely changing, and it's much farther along, and we are a movement making a difference. So, and a lot of those people who are making those differences have been on our conference call this morning and this afternoon. So thank you so much for all of that. So yes, yay to everyone who's been involved. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. And thank you, David, for doing a great job moderating. We really appreciate it, as always. So with that, we conclude Community for All 2021. Wow. Thank you for being a part of it. And please, again, I've said this several times over the morning and afternoon, please go in, look at the conference website, look at all the presentations, use those as resources, and we look forward to continuing the work and continuing the movement. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.